screen, and then I'll do a short introduction of John, and then John can get started with his slides or whatever he wants to do. Now, I saw this poster today. It'll come up in a second. I think Christine passed it on to me.
I don't know, George, I can't see it.
Scientists can't explain the puzzling lack of coronavirus outbreaks in Africa.
Is that?
Yes.
Is that? Can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so in the poster it says scientists can't explain puzzling lack of coronavirus outbreaks in Africa. And the comment at the top says, well, they take malaria tablets, hydrochloroquine equivalent daily. Maybe that's the case. And of course, we've heard that hydrochloroquine has been withdrawn from local use for some bizarre reason. And the other reason might be is maybe they've got a lot of sunshine over there, but that's something that John's going to talk about. So let's put that one to bed. And I'll bring up another share screen. If you get a chance to watch it, it's one of the most powerful speeches I've ever heard on a combination of items, vaccinations, 5G, big pharma, democracy, and more. And that's in Germany. And what I've said about that is, well, it's all in one bundle. Let's push, like, there's already been 1 million hits in just a few days on this video. And I'm saying, let's push this beyond 10 million or more, because this represents a critical mass. In other words, if enough people are of this mindset, then that can actually telepathically sweep through the population, so we're told. A little bit like the 100th monkey syndrome. And I said, how this works, join our Conversations and Miracles study group on Mondays, because it kind of explains it. All right, and I'm going to shut this one down as well. And one more share screen for now. Yes, yep. All right. So that's the official title for tonight, Complementary Medicine Alternatives to Existing Viral Conditions. And it could also have said COVID-19, and I think that's what John's going to be focusing on. And there's a little poster here. That's the official poster for tonight. If I scroll down a little bit, the description I've got here, it's taking a holistic approach to healthcare with a focus on existing viral conditions. And I've got a related video, Complementary Medicines, the Best Advice, which you people can watch that if they wish. It's something that was produced a couple of years ago up in Queensland. And anyway, Dr. Peace is described as a doctor of the people. He doesn't drive a Merc, or maybe he does, or he doesn't take expensive skiing holidays, or maybe he does, I don't know if he does. In fact, he has very little, it says. I got this from a news item. He's also a busy doctor. He spends all of his time helping patients. In fact, it can take months on a waiting list just to see him for the first time. So obviously he's had a lot of experience in that area. And I might ask John, would that be accurate?
It might have been in the past, but it's not now, because I'm retired now, so okay. I'm no longer practicing, and so I'm a retired integrated GP. So I'm quite happy to give talks, but I'm not consulting anymore.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I'll switch over to you, and there's a couple more people joining. We'll just stop the share again. Whoops, hang on. Cancel. Don't press the wrong button. Whatever you do. Okay, hand or put something in the chat screen, and that'll keep us going. So the other, I'm switching over to John now. And do you want me to bring up the slideshow right now, John?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, George.
Okay.
Yes, George. Well, ladies and gentlemen, tonight I'm going to be talking about different ways that you can help to protect yourself against the COVID-19 scare at the moment, but with particular emphasis on vitamin D. We could talk for days on everything, but just in this short Zoom meeting, I thought vitamin D was the most important thing. And vitamin C and zinc, just a little bit at the end about them as well. So as soon as we get the slides up, I'll start talking about, to start with, vitamin D.
I can't see it.
Well, you'll have to move chair.
I can't move the whole couch, George.
So I can sit on another chair.
There we go.
Okay, now do you want me to make that full screen?
Yes, I think so. Thanks, George.
Okay, I'm going to start the slideshow.
Okay. So what I'd like to share with you tonight is some information about vitamin D and why it is so important, and where the science is heading, because it's getting quite exciting now, because there's a huge amount of science about vitamin D and how it protects against viral infections, and the information about how it interacts with the COVID-19 infection is really ramping in at a great rate now, and the first clinical trials are starting to manifest as well. So next slide, George, please.
Number two.
So vitamin D is not the only thing by any means. Diet is important. People who have nutrient-rich diets, which means unrefined diets and organic food, as opposed to refined carbohydrates, refined diets, processed foods, and sugar. They're the big impediments to a good, strong immune response. So good quality diet is very important. And out of a good quality diet, we should be getting a lot of these nutrients listed here: some vitamin D, C, zinc, iron, vitamin A, selenium, magnesium, quercetin, iron, and omega-3 essential fatty acids, etc. But even with a good diet, if you live in a southern state of Australia or the northern latitudes of the northern hemisphere, you may become vitamin D insufficient or deficient because of lack of sunlight. We'll be talking more about that in a little while. It's very important to have good quality sleep, because no amount of good nutrition is going to overcome the effect of sleep deprivation. And just recently, can be helpful to reduce stress in one's life.
So next slide.
And the next one after.
Oh, right.
Okay, so getting on to the one back, George.
Oh, right.
Yeah. That's it. So vitamin D is the sunlight fiber, so called. No, back, George.
Back again.
Oh no, leave it that one. We'll go on there. So people who conditions or people who are at risk of viral respiratory tract infections, including influenza-like other viral illnesses, and this dreaded SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. The elderly are known to be susceptible, especially if they're in aged care. Can you take it back a bit, George? It doesn't fit the full screen properly. Obesity is a risk factor, and people with chronic illnesses of all sorts. And so that and listed there as diabetes, lung disease, um, cancer, and men more than women, but particularly bald men, um, and um, and then people with dark skin, particularly in these higher latitudes where the people normally have light skin. Um, the dark skinned people have been adapted to living in very sunny environments to protect themselves from being sunburned. They have dark skin, and so when they move to higher latitude areas, higher latitude countries like southern Victoria and like say in the northern areas, northern hemisphere, the high latitude countries, they become vitamin D deficient and they become prone to viral illnesses. And people who are covered up with excessive clothing or just never get out in the sun. So Muslim women who are heavily covered up, they will become vitamin D deficient wherever they live. There's a question about whether flu vaccines can actually increase the risk of becoming susceptible to other viral infections. The balance of the evidence that I've read suggests that yes, that is the case, but there's been a big backlash organised by the vaccine industry, and the fact checkers have gone and done their bit on the studies which indicated that that could be the case. So so lack of sunlight exposure and vitamin D deficiency are the other big risk factors. Next slide, George. Okay, so vitamin D is made in the body as a result of sun exposure of the skin. So it's regarded as a sunlight and diet dependent hormone in the body. There a certain amount can come from diet, like oily fish and mushrooms and eggs and fortified dairy foods. But vitamin D deficiency, in whichever way it occurs, is very important for health. And vitamin D deficiency is a factor in many chronic illnesses. And it's particularly the case with respiratory tract infections, viral infections, and influenza and COVID-19. So it's the most important nutritional deficiency in Australia, and it can occur in up to 70% of certain populations. And next slide, George. And again, next one. Now here's a little chart which summarizes fairly succinctly just what happens. UVB acts on the skin, on the cholesterol derived molecule dehydroxy cholesterol, and produces pre-vitamin D3. And D3, cholecalciferol, it then circulates in the blood, and it becomes processed, if you like, by two hydroxylases, one in the liver and one in the kidneys, but also possibly in the lungs, to produce the active form of vitamin D, which is 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is also known as calcitriol. Now, so a calcitriol then is the active form of that hormone, which then does good things in the body. As you can see in the right-hand corner there, up in the right-hand corner, it's the sort of foods which can give us some vitamin D. Fortified dairy foods, oily fish, and eggs can give us a certain amount of vitamin D, but not enough to really provide us with adequate sources without sunlight. And the sunlight exposure is so important. So people who work indoors all day and never go out in the sun will be at risk. Old people in aged care, and so on. Older people also have a poorer processing mechanism through the skin. Their skin is not so active in providing this this sun light-derived source of vitamin D. So older people are more at risk for several reasons. Next slide, George.
How come there's no vegetable dietary sources of vitamin D?
On that diagram, no, but certain mushrooms can be there.
Oh, really? They grow in the dark?
Well, they actually deliberately expose them to UV light to get them to produce vitamin D2.
Okay. How
Yeah,
about
and so mushrooms can have and often do have some vitamin D.
interesting.
Mm. Okay, can you make that a bit smaller because it's
Cheaply by
cheaply.
vitamin D supplementation and food fortification.
Exactly, yes. And that brings me to a piece I should have put up. Joseph Nicola made a statement that that these COVID-19 deaths could probably be reduced by about 80% plus if people were given a cheap vitamin supplement, that cost, very, very little. And so that's the point of that. So next slide, please, George. So here's an interesting chart which looks at the three vitamins. See, vitamin D is just one of these essential nutrients, but these tend to complement. So you can see that vitamin D does boost immune response in some ways, but it controls overaction of the immune response in a way which tends to cause inflammation. Vitamin C strengthens immune response generally, but it doesn't control inflammation like vitamin D does. And so when you combine these particular nutrients, you get an even better effect. So next slide, please, George. And here we have another chart which looks at this whole process in a different way. You can see here the sources of vitamin D: sunlight, fatty fish, fortified foods, supplements, outdoor activities, acting through the vitamin D receptor. And this has an activating effect down the T helper 2 pathway, which suppresses inflammation, but also acts down this line. And written by a researcher who really knew his stuff. So that's like the major reference, which covers hundreds of studies on vitamin D and respiratory tract infections. Okay, next slide, please.
Oops, where are we?
Next one.
That's funny. Hang on, we've got both the slideshow and the background on, so I've got to turn one of them off. What? It's confused.
Mm-hmm.
Try again. Not letting me start the slideshow. Come on. Won't let me. It's jumped ahead. That's where we were, wasn't it?
Probably, yes, it could be the next one, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. Next slide from there.
I'll go back to this.
And then the next, and the next. Okay, that's where we were. So the one after this.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, so now this is another chart which shows the seasonal impact of both the incidence of respiratory tract infections. This is upper respiratory tract infections. This is nose colds, right? And so again, they are more in winter, less in spring, and less in summer, and then becoming more again in autumn. But at the same time, if you look at these bars, the light bars, the light grey ones, they refer to vitamin D deficiency. So that's less than 10 nanograms per mil, whereas the dark bars are vitamin D sufficiency. So you can see you get more infections of upper respiratory viruses with deficiency compared to adequacy. So the next slide, please, George.
Not sure.
Well, that's another slide for
In between.
Norman Swan. Yeah? So then this next slide, it's not just flus, but vitamin D deficiency will create susceptibilities for other respiratory tract infections, tuberculosis, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, viral and bacterial respiratory infections, including pneumonias, and then the acute respiratory syndrome that comes with viruses.
Tony, I'm turning your microphone off. Hey, come on. Bit noisy next door.
And then in general, decreased lung function as in COPD. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're looking at the relationship between what happens with people who are vitamin D deficient or adequate and the tendency to test positive for COVID-19. There appears to be a relationship. So much as people say that this test is useless, well, it may not be totally useless, but several studies that listed there have shown that people who are test negative on the reverse transcriptase PCR test are less likely to show low levels of vitamin D than those who just test positive. So that's interesting, isn't it? So, next slide, please.
There's a bit more text.
Yes. Oh, yes. It's saying much the same thing, really.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, so then, in other words, it may increase the chances of you testing negative if you're adequate in vitamin D. So, next slide. Now here we have what is found in people who actually do have the COVID-19 infection, and you can see these. There's a this is the group, the infected group, the one in the middle, and the column on the left are the people the controls who are the non-infecteds. So you can, if you look at the levels of the vitamin D in the blood, they are lower in the vitamin D infecteds than in the non-infecteds, and then the deficiency levels are lower in the non-infecteds and higher in the infecteds. So, and this here didn't show up very well. It's the severe deficiency on this side here. So that is 7.3% in the non-infecteds and 24% in the infecteds. So again, it looks as though vitamin D is showing a protective effect. Next slide, please. Okay, now just before we move on, it's worth knowing a bit about the blood test. The blood test measures serum 2-hydroxy vitamin D. This is the form of vitamin D that's yet to be converted to the active form. It's the same form that you get in the vitamin supplements as well, you see. So something like this is 2-hydroxy vitamin D. Now, that's jumped a bit though, unfortunately. Those columns are out of kilter. So the deficiency's there. and the sufficiency is the next column there, and the sufficiency is this lot here, and that's optimal's there, and what has jumped is the label of the end here should have been up there. That's toxic. So greater than 300 or greater than 120 nanograms per mil is regarded as too high and could be toxic. Now, there's also different units used. We use nanomoles per litre in Australia, this lot here, but the nanograms per mil is used in America and many other parts of the world. Now, to convert from the nanograms per mil to the nanomoles per litre, you multiply by 2.5. It's worth knowing your vitamin D level, but the government, in its wisdom, has taken away the pharmaceutical benefits for vitamin D testing in most cases, to discourage people from testing. Some say that's a very unwise move. Thank you. Next test, please.
Otherwise for us, but not for them. Otherwise for us, but not for them. Yeah.
Now, this next slide here is a list of studies where they actually looked at the relationship of vitamin D status to mortality and severity of the COVID-19 infection. So there are all these studies which have come in, and so we'll just move to a couple of them. Next slide, please, George.
Gee, they're bloody loud next door.
Now, this was the first little study came out of the Philippines earlier about March this year by Mark Alipio. And some of the grassroots health in America kindly did this color graph. Now, for people who have mild coronavirus infection, they have good, optimal, adequate levels and very low instance of deficiency or insufficiency. But as you move up the severity scale, you'll find that the critical illness and the very severe illness, I don't know what we can do about that, but anyway, I'll tell you what it is. It's the first study of using vitamin D as a treatment in hospitalized COVID-19 patients. It was done in Spain, and it was a hospital which was treating COVID cases in ICU with all the usual things, but they were also using hydrochloroquine and azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, and to one group of 50, they gave vitamin D, and the other group of 26, they did not give vitamin D. And so you can see then the requirements for ICU increased. ICU admission was required in 50% of those who were not given the vitamin D, and only in 2% of the 50 who were given vitamin D. The deaths, you can see they've jumped down the bottom there, but there were 2 deaths out of 26 in the no vitamin D group, and there were no deaths out of 50 in those who were given the vitamin D. Next slide, please, George.
Are they reliable reports, peer-reviewed, or?
Yes, that one's been published.
Okay.
So, yeah, but it'll be criticised for having very small numbers, so therefore insignificant. That's all. But that's the first pilot study. Denmark, Netherlands, and Ireland. They're the ones with the best levels, and you can see also that they are more or less the countries with the lowest mortality rates. You see. So, so that's another measure. Next slide, please, George. Of the way in which better vitamin D protects against, the COVID infection. And here's another chart which was done. I think that was Ali from the Irish Medical Journal, showing that that if you look at as the vitamin D levels increase, the mortality from COVID-19 drops more or less. It's not a pure straight line, but they just do the line that averages out the results. So it's quite clear that mortality drops as vitamin D levels improve. Next slide, please, George.
Yeah, it goes below zero. That seems hard to believe.
Yeah, I think they must have overshot there. That's a good observation. So here's a more substantial chart. Now, this is interesting because it enabled us to look at more countries and look at more levels, but also it looks at the change from the 8th of April, when the cases were registered from Worldometer, to the 20th of May. And a few changes occurred. So again, if you look at, say, Norway, very high levels, and Sweden. So Norway, low mortality, still low mortality, crept up a little bit. Now, Sweden did fairly well at first, you see. Their deaths per million were only 68, but they jumped up to 380 by May. If you compare that with UK, UK had 105 per million deaths in April. But Sweden jumped up to jumped up to 526. And not still a jump, and more than Sweden, but the big jump was in Sweden, in spite of its good levels. Now, I was a bit intrigued about that, and so I did a bit of research, and what I found was that although Sweden's got a vitamin D policy, a public policy that encourages people to supplement with vitamin D, and most intelligent, educated people do that. There are two groups in Sweden which have got low vitamin D levels. One is the elderly in aged care, and the others are the Black American and Middle Eastern immigrants, dark-skinned people. And presumably the vitamin D supplementation policy has somehow or other escaped both these groups, would you believe? Now, that's surprising about the people in aged care, because you'd think that the doctors who are looking after them would have, been conversant with the vitamin D public health supplemented policy, you see, and where people are encouraged to supplement. But the studies that I've seen have shown that these two groups, the Black American, Black African and Middle Eastern immigrants, have got very low levels of vitamin D, high levels of deficiency. And likewise, the oldies in aged care also have got high deficiency levels. And so why would this be? Well, one study looked into the supplementation rates in aged care. One study said 19%, and the other said 15%. So less than 20% of these elderly are receiving supplementation in aged care. That's interesting, isn't it? Why would that be? It would mean that the doctors who are looking after them are not particularly impressed by vitamin D, just like here. We have drug and vaccine doctors advising our governments. Not a word about vitamin D. The task force which advises those doctors, the advisors of the government and other doctors, basically is the task force is what really dictates what they know and what they should be encouraged to do. Our task force, the National COVID Clinical Evidence Task Force, it makes absolutely no mention of vitamin D, none at all. So Sweden might have the same sort of problem, in a lesser extent. And but anyway, that big chart there, gives us all these mean levels, and you can see the countries with the lowest levels generally have got the higher vitamin D levels. There are a few exceptions, but that's mostly the case. So next slide, George. Any
Could have also
questions?
been, could have also been distorted by vastly increased testing over the month, maybe. So,
Yes.
yeah,
Well, this is mortality, though. It's not. It's if you're looking at the mortality statistics, they're the deaths there. They're the cases. Yeah, the cases, are prone to the errors of the testing or the over testing.
yeah.
Okay, so we've had a look at that one. I'll have to work out how to stop that jumping around because it's changed its columns.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, next test. Right, now, then, there's a typo I missed. This is about dosing. Now, in Australia here, we're allowed to have 1,000 IU, aren't we? That's all we can buy in the pharmacies and health food shops. Well, 1,000 IU is a toddler's dose. You see here, if given to an adult, it hardly increases the vitamin D level at all. So you're giving yourself a false sense of security if you take 1,000 IU if you're an adult. So in winter, it's not going to do anything to correct deficiency. You can see that here's 4,000. So 4,000 increases rapidly, fairly rapidly, but only reaches good levels. That's these are nanograms per mil. So multiplied by 2.5. That's 100 in nanomoles per liter. That's a good level. So how long does it take to reach that? It's taking about what, 4.5 months, something like that. Now that's not fast enough. If you're going to start supplementing with 4,000 per day and expect to correct vitamin deficiency by the time you head into winter. So really we have to do loading doses. So this was like a bolus of it must have been an injection, I think, of 400,000. So levels shot up fairly quickly, and then they were maintained at a good level with oral supplementation. But it would look as though a better sort of dose would probably be about 7,000 per day average. Now you can actually buy 7,000 IU from our pharmacies. They're not on the shelf. You have to go to the pharmacist and ask if they would give you some 7,000s. You can buy them in packs of 30. I think they're about $18 in Chemist Warehouse. Now, so one a day of that would be a pretty adequate dose to take to get your levels up to a good level in winter. But you probably would have to allow, at least a couple of months before you started tapering off to get your levels up well. Now, when you go to the pharmacy to buy vitamin D3, 7,000, the pharmacist will tell you, as he's been instructed to tell you, he or she, that you only take only one a week, because you see the TGA only wants us to have 1,000 a day average, you see, a toddler's dose which is not going to do anything to really increase vitamin D levels or correct the deficiency. So you just say yes, 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 and disregard that advice. And remember that if you do take vitamin D, 7,000 IU per day average, then you can still take a couple of months to get your levels up to optimal. So another way of doing it would be to buy a 50,000 imported. I think you can get 50,000 on a prescription here, but otherwise you have to import it. So that's giving you a 7,000 per day average, like one tablet a day for about 50 cents a week. That's probably what they should be doing in aged care, starting about May, no later than May, and continuing until about October. After that, once people get into sun and sunlight, well, the need for vitamin D is much reduced. But we all living in Victoria, where the sun is low latitude, and we don't get so much sunlight in winter. All of us are going to have declining levels, which could get us to insufficient or deficient levels if we don't actively get out in the sun or go to Queensland in winter. All right, next slide, please, George. And Lunik had a bit of word to say about this. We're an isolation barrel. I'm flattening the curve, and Norm is fattening the curve. That brings us up to another question. Well, one of the risk groups in with COVID-19 and other viral illnesses, the flu, etc., is obesity. And people who are overweight have a lot of adipose tissue. And vitamin D is not a water-soluble vitamin, it's a fat-soluble vitamin. And so it tends to be stored in fat. So people who have a lot of fat will sequester their vitamin D and require higher doses to achieve and maintain adequacy. So whereas you or I might use 7,000 a day to get our levels up in about a month or so, the obese people might have to use 10,000 a day. Next slide, please, George. And so again, one size doesn't fit all. And so dosage, to think that we are being, asked to just think that vitamin C is sufficient. Now you see here, here's a man who's got a lot of visceral obesity, which is regarded as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease as well. He's also showing male boobs, gynecomastia. Now that's another thing that happens with obesity, in that another thing that's rich in adipose is an enzyme called aromatase. And aromatase converts androgens like testosterone and DHEA to estrogen in the form of estrone, and estrone is what causes male boobs. You see, so overweight people have got double problems, because it's difficult to lose weight when you have high levels of E1. It happens in women as well. So women who are overweight tend to make extra E1 and become, estrogen dominant. And so inhibition of aromatase is probably necessary when people like that are showing the signs of estrogen overactivity. Next slide, George. Right, so now vitamin D on its own is not really necessarily good enough, because vitamin D requires magnesium and K2 to be taken with it. So magnesium is necessary for the conversion of vitamin D in the kidneys and lungs to the active form. It's necessary, it's a cofactor for that hydroxylase in the kidneys and lungs. And if you don't have enough magnesium, if you're magnesium deficient, then you're not going to get that healthy conversion, and you'll remain effectively vitamin D deficient. So it impairs the effectiveness of taking vitamin D or getting it from the sun even. So magnesium and K2 together are important in bone density. They're part of activating the uptake of minerals, particularly calcium, into bone. And they also prevent pathological calcification in arteries, heart valves, and also the tendency to form kidney stones and gallstones with calcium in them. So magnesium and K2 are important as well to take, especially if you're taking vitamin D and calcium. So this idea of taking a tablet that contains vitamin D and calcium is actually not a good idea, because people who do that tend to end up with calcified coronary arteries and calcified heart valves, and they tend to make kidney stones and gallstones. So that's a piece of advice that you need to be aware of when you take vitamin D and calcium. Next slide, George, please.
What's vitamin K2? What is it? Vitamin K in a vitamin, and vitamin K2 is a differential like D3.
You can get vitamin D and K2 together in some supplements, like this one. That's got iodine as well, but you can get them without iodine. So if you're going to be importing a supplement from America, vitamin D3 and K2, vitamin D3 5,000 is a good maintenance dose for the periods where less sunlight, and you could drop it back to like 1 one a week in summer if you get plenty of sunlight. But in winter, you'd be wanting to take one a day and start it before winter, a couple of months before winter, to make sure you keep your levels optimal.
And what's vitamin K found in?
Mainly found in green leafy vegetables, as far as I remember.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So that's one good thing about plenty of vegetables, that you're taking one of the cofactors of vitamin D. All right. Now, we're on to this is just, I haven't done much on vitamin C in this slideshow, but it's again, it's doubled up again. But this is the first study of high dose vitamin C given intravenously in hospitalized COVID-19 cases. It's done in China, and they used 12 grams of sodium ascorbate in a drip every 12 hours in the group that they called the high dose IVC group. And so in this, here are the mortality statistics of this study. The vitamin C group had 26 cases, and then the placebo group 28. And in brackets, I think, are the number of the percentages in brackets. And so the overall mortality in the vitamin C group was 19.2% and 35.7% in the placebo group. In people with SOFA is severe organ failure index. So those with a severe organ failure, 18.2% died in the vitamin C group and 50% in the non-vitamin C group. And the overall hospitality is as above. Yeah, somehow these have got doubled up, so they're the same, those columns. So what it means is that a high dose intravenous ascorbate significantly reduces mortality. Now, Ian Brightope, who I've been working with in his campaign to try and promote the value of these vitamin D and C, etc. His comment was, well, we would think that was rather too low a dose. And in fact, my experience with vitamin C IV, I would have thought that something more like 15 grams every 8 hours for a total of 45 grams over 24 hours would have been a better dose, a more effective dose than 24 grams over 24 hours. So that's our comment on that. But having seen this first study with giving fairly modest doses of vitamin D from Spain, when you could see that that those two nutrients are would be better given together rather than separately. So in time, hopefully, we'll have studies done where all the key nutrients that could help improve outcomes are given. But this will probably take some time, and might have to wait for another epidemic of another nasty virus to come along before we can do that. The next slide, George. Now this is the last slide, and I haven't done much on zinc, but zinc is a very important nutrient for the immune response. People who are zinc deficient are going to be having impaired immunity. Zinc is very, very important for lots of functions in the body. It's important for fertility. It's often involved in acne. Stretch marks are a sign of zinc deficiency. Sometimes white spots on nails. The best test for zinc deficiency is not actually a blood test, it's actually a taste test. You have to know how to do it. So you need to get a solution of 1% zinc sulfate, which a number of our local supplement manufacturers do make. And you take a swig of this, probably about a dessert spoon, you hold it in your mouth and move it around the mouth. And if you are zinc deficient, you may not even taste it. If you've got a moderate deficiency, you may not taste it for 6 or 8 or 10 seconds. Then you start getting a taste, and it will be a weak taste. If you are not deficient, you'll very quickly, within a couple of seconds, get a strong taste, which will become really quite unpleasant, and you'll want to spit it out quickly. So the zinc taste test, although it doesn't give you a figure on a lab result, it's a very good quick indicator of working out whether you are zinc deficient or not. And zinc acts in a way similar to hydrochloroquine, apparently. It interferes with some of the mechanisms of the by which coronavirus attacks the lung cells. Anyway, I've put that reference up for any of you who want to read it and go further with that topic. Good. That's all for the slides, George. So we might just have a free discussion and question and answers now for anyone who'd like to do that.
There's something about bald men being more zinc susceptible to zinc deficiency.
What is it?
Bald men. I think there's something in the beginning.
Yes, that's right. Bald men are thought to be more prone to bad outcomes as well, and it's something to do. It can be to do with zinc. Zinc deficiency also activates the factor which converts testosterone to dehydrotestosterone particularly in the prostate, but elsewhere as well. In the prostate, that tends to cause prostatic hypertrophy, but elsewhere it can the effective high DHT levels because of that overactivity of that 5-alpha reductase enzyme in the skin and the scalp is thought to be the cause of hair loss. So yes, it is probably to do with something with not so much high testosterone or just high testosterone. It's to do with overactivity of this enzyme, which is zinc, which is controlled by adequacy of zinc. So if you have zinc deficiency, the 5-alpha reductase enzyme will be overactive and will produce more DHT than normal, and then you'll get then a man will get the consequences of that, including prostatic hyperplasia and baldness. Yes, you're right about that.
Can we overdose on sunshine?
Yes, because you get sunburned.
Yes, that's something. But does that boost your vitamin D levels internally?
Oh yes, and I mean the important thing is for fair-skinned people like us is if we do have sun exposure, is to limit it to the point short of getting sunburned, but do it in shorter doses, like 20 minutes or maximum half an hour. You're more likely to get burnt, in the heat of the day, in the middle of the day. So shorter times in the middle of the day. But whereas people who are darker skinned, they can tolerate much longer periods in the sun because their skin doesn't get burned so easily. Like in Bali, I've got there's a lady I met who wanted me to help her with her breast cancer. Well, now she couldn't very easily buy vitamin D3 there, or it's very expensive. So I said to her, look, just get out in the sun. You've got plenty of that there. And hopefully she did that, because vitamin D3 adequacy retards cancer and improves prognosis in cancer.
So these COVID-19 studies, they are based on what they're searching for as COVID-19. I mean, if you're going to expose yourself to sunlight or vitamin D supplementation and vitamin K, C and zinc, then that's going to produce less, exosomes potentially, because, I mean, have they actually isolated COVID-19?
Look, I'm not a virologist, but I tend to think that there are such things as viruses. And the whole study of virology is about what they believe to be viruses as an organism. And so I can't really answer that question as have they actually isolated. I'm not sort of privy to the knowledge and ways of virologists. I've read a fair bit about whether or not the COVID-19 test is adequate or not. there appears to be a high false positive rate. It may not have been a test that was derived from the actual COVID-19 virus. So yes, I'm not convinced it's totally accurate. But it's a bit like saying, well, is there such a thing as an influenza virus? Has it been isolated? There are tests for assays for viruses, and whether or not these assays are yet adequate for the COVID-19, I don't know. So I'm sort of just, myself, I'm just sitting waiting to see if some clarification can come along to that question.
Because at the end of the day, if you're going to boost your immune system with these approaches, then you're going to be showing a healthier immune system, aren't you? So
yes, and so
yeah,
and that's why I put up these studies too, which if you go and look at them more closely, they indicate that giving vitamin D, correcting deficiency, reduces the incidence of infections and also the severity of the infections and the mortality. And it's not just COVID-19, it's all the viruses, influenza virus, influenza-like other viruses, other coronaviruses. And so we can get around that question by saying, look, it's regardless of the arguments, vitamin D does seem to protect us against these funny infections that we can't see, but which virologists assure us do exist. And I forgot about this, when I was in Bali. I was a bit worried about mosquitoes, you see, and went to great lengths to try and, keep from being bitten by mosquitoes, mosquito nets and so on. But really, I mean, what I was worried about was dengue fever, which is a virus. And I completely forgot that, the vitamin C I was taking, the vitamin D I was taking, which was probably protecting me anyway. And so that's something that I had to remind myself of, you see.
Yeah. And, the elderly that are unfortunately passing away from COVID do generally seem to be in the retirement villages and the care homes where, they are going in there because they are unable to care for themselves, so they're more sedentary and they're not getting outside. So,
Yes.
And so there's that compounded with the fact of decades of who knows what that they've been deficient of and not eating properly. So, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes. If I was to say, what elderly people should be given to protect them, I'd say a vitamin D3 50,000, one per week. I would say some magnesium to help activate it, about at least 200 milligrams a day. A vitamin C. There is a vitamin C that you can get made by Ethical Nutrition, which is a so-called chewable with zinc in it. Well, even just one a day of that would probably be a whole lot better than nothing. But I don't recommend people chew vitamin C tablets because they contain ascorbic acid amongst the other forms of ascorbate, which erodes the enamel of the teeth. It's not a good idea to chew these chewables. It's better to suck them. And that one that. And it's just so much more convenient to grab a vitamin C tablet and have to muck around, mixing up powders into a drink and that sort of thing. But if you could be bothered to mix up powders, then the best of all, I think, is magnesium ascorbate, because it not only gives you vitamin C in an alkaline form, but it gives you also magnesium to help activate the vitamin D. So that's those three things: vitamin C, magnesium, and vitamin D, and zinc as well. So if they were to have one a day of a source of those three, and then 50,000 a week of vitamin D3, I'd say that we could cut out the all these surges of deaths from influenza and COVID-19 or whatever virus happens to come along.
Yeah.
But we've got a long way to go to do that, because the medical profession wouldn't accept supplementing unless they had proof with clinical trials. You see?
Well,
And,
that's right. My girlfriend actually works at an integrated health laboratory.
yes.
And, you know, they were doing COVID testing, but they're not doing it now. They're just, they're flat out with everything else.
Yeah.
And she said that she actually runs the lab, and she said they are regularly meeting with the health board, because the health board try everything that they can that they really don't like them doing the integrated health. You know, they do poo samples and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating that they don't like it, do they?
No, I mean, what we really need to do would be to have a study done whereby certainly vitamin D, but preferably vitamin D plus C plus zinc and magnesium were tested against the vaccines. So you'd have a flu vaccine group, a COVID group, the vaccine group plus the no vaccine plus supplement group. That's what needs to be done.
Yep.
But, you know, I mean...
I thought I'd show this little chart, though.
Yes.
Straight from the government website. And what it is the COVID-19 deaths by age group and sex in Australia. And you can see the age distribution, 0 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 29. There's almost zero deaths below 60 years of age.
Yes.
The major deaths are in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it so happens that the average age of the COVID deaths is pretty much the same as the life expectancy age in Australia. That is so blatant and obvious.
It's so obvious.
It's so, it's tragic comedy.
Yeah.
To me, it is anyway.
They're dying a little bit older than the average mortality.
Yeah. But anyway, we're not allowed to question those sort of things, are we?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What other comments have we got from others?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. So I'm vegetarian, so D2 appears to be the only option I can go with. D3 is based on animal products. So are there any decent D2 supplements that you'd recommend?
I'm not sure that they're available, actually. Yes, most of the D3 derives from either fish sources or from other sources. So I don't know what you're going to do there. I'll have to look into that and see if I can come back with any answers, Chris.
I've got well, I just went scurrying through eBay while you were talking, or during the discussion, and I found one from the UK, and I also found one from Melbourne. So
Bioceuticals.
Say that again, sorry.
Bioceuticals is vegan, as far as I'm aware. The practitioner range, Bioceuticals.
Want to spell that?
It's in the chat. I've put it up in the chat. I think it's Bioceuticals.
Okay.
I just realized we have Dr. John. Is it Piese or is it Piers?
Well, it should be PS, but that's a bit hard for the Aussie tongue, so it ends up being Peace.
Okay, got it.
Peace is good. Peace is good.
Yeah. But it was originally a French name from probably Normandy, I think. So, but the French would say PS, and so do the Brits as well.
Yeah, just you, Bob. You're French. Aren't you?
Sorry?
You're part French, aren't you? Yeah.
16th century French.
Yeah.
Well, that's the same. My forebears apparently, they must have been Huguenots, I think, and I think they escaped to Britain in the Inquisition period.
Yeah, that's where my family came from.
Yes, and then they set up in Britain, and then they lived there until the family migrated to WA in 1804. So And then they tend to settle in WA and Tasmania at first before dispersing to other parts of Australia.
Yeah, what about the sunlight in Tasmania?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because Tassie, of course, you'd expect to have lower levels. Now, I've found difficulty getting statistics from the different states because often they don't tell you what time of year they take the tests, and it's no point, because it varies so much seasonally. But Tasmania seems to be having less of a bad run than we are, although they're further south. And I can imagine that well, it's either two things. It's either or both. It's either that there are more people who are supplementing or eating oily fish or something like that, or that because this population density is just so more sparse than say in Melbourne, that then they have a natural social distancing that makes spreading infections a bit more difficult. In Sweden, for instance, Sweden's problems are in Stockholm, in the capital, in their big city. Hardly any problems at all outside of Stockholm. And so in the countryside, as here really, there's hardly any coronavirus epidemic at all.
Who's that?
Sounds like.
I had a query on viruses. I've seen various reports saying that viruses are not contagious, and one of the tests that gets quoted is they did tests back in 1918 with the Spanish flu, where they took the bodily fluids of infected people with the virus, and they injected them into people that didn't have the virus, and it had almost zero effect.
Almost zero.
It had zero effect. That's what they say.
100 trials, no result.
What do you think of that, John? I mean, I'm a bit confused with that. Are they saying that viruses are not contagious at all?
Well, maybe the body fluids they used didn't contain the viruses. I mean, viruses are mostly airborne spread, aren't they?
Yeah, well, that's, yeah.
Except for some like, dengue and so on, mosquito-borne ones.
Yeah, the bodily fluids that they spoke about, it's quite gross. Mucus and goodness knows what else. So it wasn't pleasant to listen to the protocols of the trial, but it was basically just anything that you would expect as a product of the disease. So,
I don't really know the answer to that.
this was the trial. This was the trial that Dr. Kaufman referenced.
Ah, yes.
So he's fairly alternative, you could say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe there's often confusion with bacterial and virus type infections, where bacterial, you could say, are definitely contagious. Could you say that a common cold can be bacterial or virus, or is it one or the other? I'm not sure.
Well, it's thought to be initially viral, but then the bacterial secondary infection tends to follow on. So it's a mixture, isn't it?
Yeah, that makes it a bit confusing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And yet it's something so basic. We can't cure the common cold, we're told. How are we going to cure a COVID strain?
Well, I mean, you saw the figures about vitamin D with the common cold. There's research with vitamin C, the common cold. And then there's these zinc lozenges, zinc acetate lozenges, that have been shown to be beneficial. It's the same three again, isn't it? D, C, and zinc, which appear to have benefit in the the cold. Separately, of course, it's never been studied with the three together, but it would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Oh, well, I'm still confused.
George, did you see that one from Kaufman on, I forget the guy's name, Brian, I forgot his last name. Did you see Kaufman on Brian thingy show where he was talking about can't catch a virus?
I've heard of those things, it's also been reported through Arthur Furstenberg's work,
Yeah.
who's the author of Invisible Rainbow,
Yeah.
and he makes the case very strongly that influenza is actually an electrical disease, and he shows timelines and graphs showing that influenza had a big spike when electricity was turned on in the 1880s or 90s. What is it?
Well, the big one was Spanish flu, and that was the widespread release of the electrical grid, wasn't it?
Well, the electrical and the radio networks that were put out around the world. That's when they came on.
Oh.
And there was a huge spike, according to that data. But the same book showed those tests where they tried to prove that the viruses were infectious, and they found the opposite.
Okay.
So I don't know about that.
This is the video, I'm sure I'll post it in the chat. This is the video that I watched that I found not compelling, but interesting. And that was the one that Kaufman was on.
Okay.
So that was, it only goes for about 10 minutes. I don't expect it to happen now, but yeah, this is the one. Viruses have never been proven to be airborne or transmitted between people. Now, I'm not here to say that I think this is true. I was just curious, that's all.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm a bit too heavily steeped in the orthodoxy of the theories of virology to be able to give a dissonant opinion on that. I think I'll sit
You'd be the most qualified here, wouldn't you?
You know, I mean, I've sort of pretty much been trained to believe in viruses, and it's going to take a little bit for me to give up the
100%.
that
Yeah.
assumed knowledge. You know?
It's not just paradigm shifting, it's paradigm obliterating. So.
Yes.
Well, there might be a correlation both ways.
It might be somewhere in between, yeah.
Yeah, the Furstenberg stuff. What?
Listen.
Yeah. You off now, are you?
What is it?
I don't know.
Ethan.
Oh, sorry. A little interruption there. What was I saying? Oh, yeah, the information that Arthur Furstenberg was showing also correlated severe sun activity with influenza as well, because what he was showing is that influenza would break out all over the world, even though the contagious model doesn't account for that. It's as if a blast of radiation from the sun can produce influenza. And the very word influenza comes from influence. You know, they're saying it's the influence of the stars and the sun, which is, I thought, was interesting. But I'm not sure if it's helpful. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, who knows? But I mean, there have been people who are studying why it is that they've had COVID, a lot of COVID cases in some of the sunnier, lower latitude countries, like India, where you'd say, well, they get plenty of sun, so why would they be vitamin D deficient? But where they've actually done assays, it appears as though many of these dark-skinned peoples actually are vitamin D deficient quite badly. And even Indonesia has apparently got quite a high level of vitamin D deficiency, and India too. So, it's hard to know what is the total picture. What are all the inputs to susceptibility to viruses?
Mm.
But vitamin C is a very powerful virus killer. I've seen it happen so many times. I mean, if you get someone with an early flu, a flu-like illness, you're never going to know immediately that it is a particular influenza virus. But if a person has flu-like symptoms and they very quickly get an intravenous ascorbate infusion, you can totally stop the symptoms in their tracks virtually immediately. And I've seen it happen with patients. I've probably given probably 10,000 IVC infusions in my professional lifetime. I've received a couple myself too. I remember the only time I've ever had the flu was, how long ago it was probably 30 years ago. But I was going off to East Gippsland for a holiday, and blow me down, overnight I got the flu. But I went into my practice and the nurse was there, and I got her to give me an IV infusion, killed the symptoms immediately, and I was able then to drive off down to Malakuta totally symptom-free for the rest of the day. That's how powerful it is.
I was about to ask, so what's your take on terrain, or this terrain theory? Have you got any initial thoughts on that? Based upon it seems fairly new, or at least revamped.
The brain injury, what, from COVID-19?
Terrain theory.
Oh, terrain theory. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
With that?
No, not familiar.
Well, the premise being that that you don't get sick unless the terrain is compromised. Terrain being your own toxicity is high. You can't, unless your toxicity is high, you can't get disease.
It sounds plausible, doesn't it?
Well, I like it. I mean, it seems to explain a lot that we haven't been able to put our finger on.
Yes, and toxicity is just another factor that may be affecting the immune response as well, you see. Weakening the immune response.
Well, we've got so many sources of toxicity today that people aren't aware of, from fluoride in water to glyphosate in our crops. So, certainly some plausibility to it from my point of view, given that no one's really noticing the insidious nature of glyphosate.
Yes. Yeah. Makes sense to me.
Can I ask?
Oh,
Yes.
Tony, you muted yourself.
What your thoughts are on liposomal vitamin C, and does it need to be used in conjunction with normal vitamin C?
Well, it's supposed to be better absorbed. In other words, it's got a stronger potency per quantity, and I have no reason to dispute that. I've tended not to use it so much because it's it's more expensive.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the liposomal elements, the emulsifying factors that are used, could have any negative effect on the gut. I don't know about that. The little I've used didn't bother me, but I had a call today from the brother of a man who's been starting to use it for as part of his treatment for tuberculosis, and he thought he got nausea after using it. I've not heard other people report getting nausea. But he's been loaded up with pretty heavy anti-tuberculous drugs, and as well as he's been using paracetamol for pain, which of course is hugely liver toxic. So I think it was probably just, I wouldn't say it was necessarily the liposomal C which gave him nausea, but maybe the whole battery of all the other toxins in his body might have made it a little bit less tolerable. So, but as far as I know, it's fine, but it's more expensive. And I haven't used it that much. I mean, I went to Bali last year and I didn't take liposomal C there, partly because of weight and cost. And you tend to use liquids up more quickly than powders. And but I had one experience where I used vitamin C for an acute infection in Bali. I got a wound infection. I put some skin off my shin, and I couldn't dress it as frequently as I wanted to because I didn't have enough non-stick dressings. I couldn't buy them in Bali, and so it got this wound, this open wound got infected, and at the same time I went for a long walk to that day to introduce friend to Ubud, and then I also got a bronchitis from our host together. And by the time I got back that evening, I was looking pretty grey apparently. And I had a fever, and I had a cellulitis down my leg. Leg was all swollen and red and tender, and that's the sort of situation where people can get into real trouble. They usually get carted off to hospital for that sort of situation. But anyway, I just said no. Look, let's give the vitamin C a go overnight. We redressed the wound, cleaned it, and I took a teaspoon of magnesium ascorbate powder every 3 hours during the night. So that's about 3 grams per 3 hours. And that's a gram per hour. Orally. It didn't give me, it didn't exceed bowel tolerance. And the next morning, 9 o'clock, cellulitis all gone, totally. Cough, bronchitis completely gone. And so vitamin C in that form, certainly even orally, it can be really quite potent if you use it frequently enough, but not to the extent that you don't absorb it. And whether or not liposomal C is as good as that, I don't know. There's another way of using vitamin C to get really high blood levels, almost equivalent to intravenous, and that is a rectal ascorbate retention enema. So you can use sodium ascorbate, dissolve it in cold water, and even cool it in the fridge for a little while. And you do a bowel washout with an enema, and then you fill the syringe up with the cold vitamin C solution, which will help you to retain it. And it's been shown that that is pretty much as effective as intravenous ascorbate. And that comes from Germans' knowledge back from the 1950s and 60s, when they were using intravenous and rectal ascorbate separately to treat acute hepatitis. And they found that the ascorbate retention enemas were as good as intravenous ascorbate.
That could probably apply for many, I guess, substances, or
it probably would apply to any infection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been making my own crude, I'd say, as liposomal vitamin C using a blender and some soy lecithins, if I can get my hands on sunflower, but they're a lot more expensive. And then using an ultrasonic cleaner.
Yes.
And I've been able to have maybe up to 20 or 30 grams of vitamin C in one hit, and not have any issues like running to the toilet or bowel issues in a single day. Yeah, so it's but it does have a foul taste, but it's nothing that I can't handle.
Yeah. Very good.
Can I share my story of the cure of the common cold?
Yes, why not?
It pushes a few boundaries, though. In 2015, we took a trip to Brazil, and we went to central Brazil, and the pilgrimage was to go and see John of God, which some of you might have heard of. He was the most prolific faith healer in the world today. And there's lots of information on that. He's a little bit discredited at the moment, and he's locked up because of interference with some of the patients or whatever. However, the healing aspect appears to be genuine, and when we were over there, we actually saw operations in front of our eyes where people were cut open with what appeared to be little discomfort, and we also witnessed a surgical instrument. What would you call it? It's like a scissors?
Like a pair of scissors with a round.
Yeah, it's like a pair of scissors, and we saw that surgical instrument pushed in through the nostrils, would have been going up into the brain. I couldn't watch that. It looked horrible. Christine saw it, saw the whole thing twice. Right?
It was great.
And I just could not. I couldn't watch it, and I've seen it on video too. I can't watch it on video either. It looks horrific, but there's no discomfort. The entity that's working on people when that happens says this is not necessary. We only do this as a demonstration. Normally they just do psychic operations, and a lot of people have reported some incredible results from the healings. They take you into an operation room, and Christine had her back restructured, and she could actually feel them working on her. And if she hadn't had that work done on her, she told me that she wouldn't have been able to prance all over Machu Picchu the week after. Right? And for myself, when I went in front of the entities, there's many entities that work through John of God. I was sort of waved on. I mean, I'm a yoga practitioner, and I don't have those sort of issues, right? And so I was kind of waved on. They still gave me some herbs, but in general, you go for one audience in front of the entities, and you're part of a line of thousands of people that are going past him. And in general, you stay for 2 weeks because you might have a follow-up. It's like in the first week, you might have a psychic operation, and it's like a real physical operation. The second week, you go through the queue again to get reassessed, whatever. Anyway, in the second week, I found that John of God was going to be in Sydney the following year. And so I prepared some information and a poster to have in order for me to conduct a tour of people from Melbourne to Sydney in the following year when John of God was going to be there. And so I prepared the information, but prior to going to see John of God in the second week, I came down with the very worst cold I've ever had. It was my sinuses were running. They were shocking. You know, I was sneezing all over the place. It was the worst kind of cold situation I'd ever experienced. And when I went to the entities, and I was seeking endorsement from them to run this Melbourne to Sydney tour. And we did run it, by the way. We had a group of 25. We organised all the accommodation and the aspects of the tour. And it was very successful. But anyway, when I went to get the permission, John of God had a different entity working through him at that time. And usually when you go through John of God, he's kind of abrupt and dismissive and all this. But this was a different entity. He looked me straight in the eye, and he gave me a big wink, as if to say, yes, we're endorsing your planned tour. Now, anyway, in the same day, we went to what they call the casa, where there can be hundreds of people seated. Now, I was following Christine, and she ended up going one way, and I was trying to follow her, and I couldn't follow her. For some bizarre reason, I ended up going the other way, and I ended up in what they call the meditation room. And there's hundreds of people in there meditating. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not supposed to be here. And so I went up to one of the guides and I was saying, I'm not supposed to be here. Can I get out? And they went to me, shh, no, you have to just go through, right? You have to be quiet because of the meditators. And so I didn't have a choice. I ended up in the middle of the operation room, and there's about 100 people in the operation room, and I was right smack in the middle, and I couldn't move. And I'm thinking, I'm not supposed to be here. I wasn't told I was going to get an operation. There's nothing I could do about it. And anyway, while there, I felt a big sneeze coming on. And I asked myself, is this really necessary right now? And guess what? The symptoms went away, the sneeze symptoms. And by the time I got out of that operation room, I didn't initially notice it, but the cold was gone. I had no symptoms of cold anymore. Now, what is going on there? Was that a demonstration to me of this psychic healing power? We're going to be covering more metaphysics soon, the Monday session, and of course we do cover a lot of metaphysics. Any thoughts on that, John?
No, but it brings to mind another story that I heard.
Yeah.
When Ian Gawler was
Yes.
seeking solution from his cancer, he went to the Philippines and he went to other healers, but he also went to Sai Baba in India. And on one occasion, he went from his lodgings, I think in Bangalore, to see Sai Baba at Puttaparthi at the ashram. And when he saw Sai Baba, he actually had a conversation with Sai Baba, and he told Sai Baba that his wife, Gail, at the time, was sick back in Bangalore. She was really ill with a high fever. And when he got back to the place they were staying, Grace was just dramatically better. And she said that while she was sort of lying in a febrile state, very ill in the bed, there was like a blinding sort of flash of light, burst of light, not a flash, but a sustained blue-white light, which just came in and just filled the room, dazzled her. And then from that time onwards, she was well again, just very dramatically.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, same sort of, amazing thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I've heard another Sai Baba story from the local yoga centre that we used to go to in Sherbrooke, and they used to organise groups to go to India and to the Sai Baba's temple, and but the husband of one of the ladies that used to go would ridicule the whole thing and ridicule her. Anyway, she put up with that, and the group put up with that. One day this guy was driving in his car and he had a blowout in one of the tyres. He was travelling at high speed, and the car went off the road and there were big trees. And as he was going off the road, he swears Sai Baba appeared next to him and looked at him and said, "Don't worry." And remarkably, he missed every tree and came to a stop, right? And he burst into tears.
Of course you would.
He was a changed man from that point. So this came directly through the yoga group that that's where I started doing yoga in the Shire of Sherbrooke.
Mm.
Yeah. So those are dramatic stories, but they're probably more common than what we think.
Yes, I think so. Probably many people have had common stories of interventions like that in their lives, I think. I mean, I've got a few to tell you if we had more time. But I mean, you know, I went last year to some sessions of the Explore series seminars with LL, which is a Christian ministry. And I've been particularly interested in healing, you know, for a long, long time. And in my younger days, I went to a seminar with Peter Horriban, who was one of the founding leaders and still is of the LL Ministries, which is a ministry that just concentrates on healing. That's really what they're there for and what they do. And I saw Peter Horriban involved in a healing at that seminar. There was a man who had, as a probably an 18 or so year old, had got bucked off a horse, and he landed on his backside, and from then onwards he had dreadful pain, which lasted and lasted and lasted for 20 years by the time he got to that seminar. And he asked for, you know, he came forward and asked for healing in the morning tea break. And so a couple of the team gathered around him with Peter Horriban, and they listened to his story, and then they just quietly sort of prayed over him, trying that they can get intuitions as to what's going on. And what they got was that in the time when he was in the second or so when he was falling off the horse, he had a terror that he was going to be left paraplegic. And he wasn't paraplegic, he survived that. But the pain persisted, and all the best treatment and rehab that he had couldn't uncover the cause or find a solution to his pain. Anyway, these healers, what they got from their praying in prayer was that there was a spirit of terror locked up in his body. And so they prayed for release of this spirit of terror. And he went through a bit of a cathartic experience. They had to help lower him to the floor. He was like in a trance, and he was wailing and carrying on, and for a few minutes, and then at the end of it, he became peaceful again, and he came to, and they lifted him up to his feet again, and the pain was completely gone, and that pain did not come back again. And so, you know, that was, to me, I mean, that's the sort of thing you wouldn't see, you wouldn't believe unless you saw it. And I had a similar experience at one of their seminars. I had a cycling accident, 2012, I think it was. And I came off on a corner when my new bike's very strong brakes locked the back wheel. And I crashed onto my left side and I fractured my pelvis. And so I got over that one, but then I had another cycling accident in 2012. The previous one was about 2 years before. And the second one was a bit worse than the first. And I ended up in hospital. I was, you know, I had to be cared for. I had to get special crutches. I had another fracture as well. I had to operate on and so on. And anyway, but after this, there was a trauma. I was traumatized emotionally, and not once the physical healing was occurred. I still had this trauma, because every time I saw like a cycling accident, say in the Tour de France, I would just freak out. And I just got back from hospital after that last accident, and I couldn't sleep. When you have a fractured pelvis, it's very hard to sleep because every time you move, you get pain, and you can't lie on the affected side, and so you can only go one way, you see, and then going back to your on back is difficult. So you end up going out and trying to find someone more comfortable, which I did. With the crutches. I went onto the couch, turned on the television, and the Tour de France was on. I saw just as an accident occurred, and the helicopter cameras zoomed in on the Astana team had gone off on a corner, and they all crashed down into bushland. And here they were carrying up Vladimir Vinokurov, two of his teammates, over their shoulders. And he was just only weight bearing on one leg, and he was wincing in pain. And I saw this, and I bawled.
Oh, you put.
I had tears falling on my face. I was so distraught, And every time I saw an accident after that, for this next 7 years, I could not hold the tears back. It just really affected me. And if I even told people about this, the tears would come. I couldn't control them. And anyway, so at this seminar, one of the team asked me if I'd like to have some prayers for healing. And now he was a highly trained Christian healer. He knew what he was doing. And he prayed over me. And he prayed for the healing of the, what had happened was that not only did I have this emotional trauma, but I had chronic pain. Like sitting in that seminar, I'd have a gnawing pain in my right hip area. And I just had to put up with it. Every time I went to a seminar or a meeting and sat for any more than a few minutes, the pain would come on. I couldn't lie on my right side for more than a few minutes because it just got too painful. And although it was healed, the pain was there and persisting. So first of all, he prayed for healing of the physical injury, and then he prayed for healing of the emotional trauma, which I told him about. And then he sort of paused and he tuned in again, and he thought, there's still something there. He sensed there was still something there. So he prayed about that, and he got it that there was a spirit of trauma. A spirit of, a spirit of physical trauma in the injury area still there. So he prayed for release of that. And up to that point, I still had the pain, you see. Anyway, so he prayed for release of that, and immediately the pain went. And I've never had that pain sitting come back ever again.
Wow.
And I can lie on my right side, for a long time. And so that to me was, quite dramatic, because I was healed just in the space of 5 or 10 minutes of both the the residual physical trauma, the emotional trauma, and this funny thing that was going on that was still locking me into pain. And so that was just my little experience.
Yeah, well, you obviously would appreciate the benefits of yoga.
Yes.
And, I'd throw up the question, why isn't everybody doing yoga or some sort of psychophysical spiritual practice? Because it's not just exercise. For example, I've had at least a couple of people spontaneously bursting into tears during a class, and they don't know why.
Yes.
People get concerned about that, and I just say, well, just don't worry about it. It's going to pass. And that's consistent with the idea that trauma is stored in the body.
Yes.
And you don't even know it's there. And the one way to deal with that trauma, whatever it is to go and get psychoanalyzed, right? But the problem with psychoanalysis is it could take years, and you've got to relive the whole incident all over again, and it's quite traumatic. Whereas what you can do instead is do the yoga, and guess what? It gets rid of it without any psychoanalysis. You don't need it. Just get rid of the bloody thing,
I had another experience where I was going to get some. Had to go to an appointment to get some PRP injections into my right knee, which is as a result of another, youthful injuries. having problems. And I left my phone. So I went back up, and I was staying with Narita up at Ferny Creek.
Yeah.
I went back up to grab my phone. And as I turned around, I caught my leg on the bedclothes, which are hanging down on the corner, and sort of locked my leg into it, and I fell forward. And I fell forward and cracked my other knee on the floor. But then I had to sort of run down the stairs and back up the car. And it was very, very painful. And it was about 8 out of 10 pain, and as I was driving down Churchill Drive to get onto the Burwood Highway, it was really quite bad. So I just started doing mindfulness breathing with affirmations that I breathed in healing and breathed out pain. And I just did this with every breath thereafter. By the time I got down to the Burwood Highway, getting under the Eastlink Freeway, the pain was down to about 10%. By the time I got to Malvern, where the clinic was having the injection, it was completely pain-free. And but I was in a lot of pain, and so that was quite a salutary experience, because I was sort of desperate. I had to do something, and that's what I chose to do.
Yeah, you mentioned the Christian faith healing before, and that's the case. It doesn't matter what faith you have; it can have a dramatic effect.
Yeah, there are healers in Bali who are clearly they're spiritual healers of some sort. And they come through their Balinese, Hinduism type background, but they definitely are. They're psychic healers, and there are people like that. You mentioned St. John of God. There are people like that all over the world, I think.
Yeah, there are, yeah.
Yeah. But it's just a very interesting area of this whole area of healing and what happens, and the number of people who've had interventions in their lives that profoundly affect their whole view of the world. I've had several where my life's been saved. I remember one time I was doing photography, waterfall photography, and I'd go around Australia photographing waterfalls, you see, and I had to get into some pretty risky, challenging situations sometimes to get a good angle on a waterfall, And I was up in those ranges north of Mansfield. What's that national park up there? And anyway, there's a couple of nice waterfalls in there.
Been there.
Strzelecki?
No, it's east of the Strzelecki. It's the other side of the Benalla road to Benalla. It's
past the bluff or something, but I forget the place. I know of the place.
Yeah, if you take the road from Mansfield to Benalla, it's on the right-hand side. If you take the road across to the King Valley, it's just north of that road.
Yeah.
Path. Anyway, there's a really nice waterfall there, and I thought, I can get a side-on angle of this, but I had to go down onto a ledge, down the top part of the cliff, you see, and as I went down, I put my foot on a large rock, which I thought was solid, but the thing moved, and I fell forwards. And I would almost have certainly fallen right down that 150-foot cliff and, crashed to my death. But something grabbed me from behind and pulled me back. I mean, it's an astounding thing that happened. It grabbed my pack and pulled me back, you see. And, I had to feel, well, maybe I'm meant to be alive, But I don't know how many people have had experiences like that. Like, I've had a couple of others too, really, where there have been interventions, and so yeah, there's a lot of things that we can't explain, but and the whole way the world's evolving now, this coronavirus epidemic is extraordinarily perverse, the way it's been engineered and managed, and one can't help feeling that there's a real sort of, perverse, some people say satanic force at work here. And but you know, at the same time, you know, the evil is almost always balanced by good, and in the long run, good tends to prevail. Just where we're at in that cycle, I don't know, but I think it's starting to turn. And I'd say in another year's time, people will look back and say and ask how on earth this happened, and realize that the world was basically in the control of very evil forces. And so yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. But it's created a world recession that could be as bad as the Great Depression. But it depends on those countries that lockdown. There's some countries that are not locking down as they are expected to lock down, and so they will probably survive better than others.
Yeah.
It looks as though the United States is going to take a real clobbering because they've really been in the grip of all this this falsity and fear mongering and so on that's been, you know, constructed in order to improve vaccine uptake and sales. You know? So anyway, it's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah, the stuff that's happening is that's actually entirely appropriate because of the difficult restrictions we're getting subjected to. People are asking questions at last. You know, whereas before they're a bit blasé about the whole thing. But you know, humanity needs to change.
Yes.
It's there's no excuse for the way the world is being run at the moment, and it's an opportunity for change. You know, because now a lot more people are involved in questioning the way things are. You know, the way things are run. So we don't have to look at it in a negative context, and quite frankly, we don't really want to go back to the way things were either. That's the conclusion that I can make from that.
Yes.
So it's all good in a way. Yeah, I'm going to be presenting something along those lines on Monday night. Very much more specific. If you can consider attending for that one as well.
That's the miracles one, is it?
The conversations and miracles, yeah. Because look, people tend to think that these spiritual things are airy fairy and of no consequence, and I sort of introduce some of the concepts little by little to some of these law groups that are having a hard time coming to terms with what's going on. Sometimes I have a hard time coming to terms with what's going on as well. But it's not very well received. Sometimes, though, it generates a good response. Some of the metaphysics says things like one of the problems is that nice people, especially the nice spiritual people, don't want to acknowledge that we live in a murderous thought system. This is a predatory universe. We prey on each other, and however we can transcend that with consciousness. But in the meantime, we're going to be attacking each other. It's part of the balance of good and evil, and it's the opportunity for us to evolve to the higher level. Yeah, it's the abuse itself is not acceptable, and if you don't stand up and say it's not acceptable, then you're going to continue to be abused. And it even suggests that sometimes we must go to war, not to hurt back, but to demonstrate an aspect of who we are with another aspect of who we are not. Sometimes it's necessary. So in other words, pacifist theories don't work. But on the other hand, you also need to balance that where you need to with turning the other cheek and acknowledging what's going on is appropriate. Anyway, we'll save the rest for later.
What's the password for Monday, George?
Same.
9.
Yeah. Now
Okay.
you're giving it away.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Everybody knows what it is anyway.
I thought it was Ninny.
It can be if you want. So.